In the West, some wounds are carved deeper than any bullet because they're made by family. Summer, 1881. The wind over Red Hollow carried more than dust that day. It carried the stench of betrayal. Elara Quinn, towering at 7 feet 2, had been told since childhood she was too big, too strange, too much to feed. But nothing cut deeper than the morning her own father shoved her out into the dirt, his last words dripping with contempt. "You'll never be a wife. You'll never give a man a child." She walked away barefoot, coins rattling in her pocket like the last heartbeat of hope. For weeks, she slept in barns and abandoned sheds, trading work for scraps of bread. Each step only sharpened the fury twisting inside her, the kind that doesn't just burn, it brands. That afternoon, she came into town only for flour and coffee, but the stairs burned hotter than the July sun. Men leaned on railings, smirking like they knew the weight of every insult she'd ever carried. She kept her eyes forward, until a sudden gust tore the coins from her palm, sending them tumbling into the street. And that's when Jonas Rourke stepped out from the feed store, 6 feet 4, broad-shouldered, with eyes that didn't flinch. He didn't stare at her height, he didn't smirk. He just pressed each coin into the dust before the wind could steal them, stood, and offered them back like it was the most natural thing in the world. What happened next would ignite a chain of events that the town of Red Hollow would whisper about for decades. Because when a man with nothing to lose crosses paths with a woman everyone's tried to break, someone's bound to bleed before it's over. Jonas's hand lingered just long enough for Elara to notice it was calloused. Hands that had seen years of hauling freight, repairing wagons, and wrangling horses in storms. That alone might have been enough to earn her guarded respect. But it was the way he didn't look away from her eyes that kept her still. In Red Hollow, most men either stared at her like she was some traveling oddity, or looked through her as if she were part of the dust. Jonas did neither. He set the sack of oats against the wall, shifted his weight like he'd already decided something, and asked quietly, "Where are you staying?" Her instinct screamed, "Don't tell him." That was the rule she'd lived by. Never let anyone know where you slept. Never give them the chance to find you in the dark. But something in his voice wasn't a demand. It was a measure, a test. "The old barn, East Edge," she answered anyway. He didn't flinch. "That place won't keep out a hard wind, let alone rain." His next words fell like a stone into still water. "I've got a room past the cottonwoods. Bed's clean. Door bolts from the inside." For a moment, her fury rose again, not at him, but at the absurdity of the offer. Men didn't give without wanting. Her life had taught her that generosity always had teeth. But as the prairie wind cut through her patched dress and the ache in her boots sharpened, she thought about her father's voice spitting venom, the long nights staring at rafters in borrowed barns, the emptiness of being nowhere and belonging to no one. "All right," she said. They walked out of town side by side, neither looking back at the saloon porch where two men muttered behind them. She noticed the even rhythm of his stride, how he didn't slow down for her or speed up to lead, just matched her step for step. By the time the narrow wagon trail curved toward a lone square house with weathered gray boards, she'd decided one thing. She would take the room, but she would not owe him. The porch creaked under her weight, the first real threshold she'd crossed in months. Inside, the scent of pine soap and strong coffee wrapped around her, almost disarming her anger. Almost. Because no matter how safe the bolt felt, she knew there were eyes in Red Hollow already calculating how to break her down again. And this time, she swore, someone would bleed before she let it happen. If you want to see exactly how Elara turns that promise into a fight the whole town will remember, drop a 1 in the comments and subscribe. If not, hit like anyway and stick around. What's coming next? You won't want to miss. Morning came slower in Jonas's house than anywhere Elara had slept before. No banging barn doors, no rooster from a neighbor's yard, no footsteps creeping too close in the dark. Instead, there was the muted thump of boots on the porch, the faint rattle of coffee mugs, and the low hum of a stove coming to life. For a dangerous moment, she almost forgot herself, almost believed she was simply home. She pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped into the kitchen. Jonas glanced up once, not startled, just acknowledging. "Coffee's hot, bread's fresh," he said, his voice steady like the sound of a wagon wheel on hardpack. It wasn't an invitation to talk, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Over breakfast, he spoke little, mentioning only that he'd be hauling fence posts south of town. Then, without ceremony, he told her the mercantile had a line of credit in his name. "If you need anything, you tell him you're staying here." The words landed heavier than he knew. No one had ever given her permission like that, not without strings. She forced herself to nod, refusing to let her voice betray the strange tightness in her chest. By mid-morning, she'd made up her mind. If she was going to be under his roof, she'd keep busy. She swept the floors until the wood shone, boiled the linens, and even mended a loose hinge on the pantry door with the small hammer she found in a drawer. Work was safer than thinking. Still, when she walked into Red Hollow that afternoon to buy sugar and beans, the air shifted. Conversations slowed. Eyes followed her. The dressmaker's apprentices whispered behind cupped hands. A boy near the trough smirked and made some joke about a woman fit for a giant's table. She didn't stop, didn't even blink, just bought what she needed and left. But inside, her fury coiled tighter. Back at the house, she put the beans to soak and set meat to simmer, the steady rhythm of chopping onions calming her pulse. She wasn't cooking out of obligation. This was her claiming space, leaving her mark in a place she intended to keep. By sundown, she heard the wagons creak and the steady clop of hooves. Jonas stepped in, his shirt damp with sweat, carrying a sack of potatoes and a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a slab of salted pork. "Figured you could use it," he said. They ate without hurry, his silence comfortable, hers deliberate. When he finally asked if anyone had given her trouble, she met his gaze and said, "Nothing I couldn't walk past." His jaw tightened, and the weight behind his quiet reply, "If someone does, you tell me," was enough to make her believe he'd mean it. That night, behind her bolted door, she lay awake longer than she'd planned, not out of fear, but because the idea had begun to take root. Maybe this wasn't just shelter. Maybe it was the beginning of something that could outlast the whispers. 2 days later, the wind shifted in Red Hollow. It wasn't just the smell of the prairie rain coming in from the west. It was the sense that the quiet between Elara and the town was wearing thin. Jonas had spent the morning oiling the wagon wheels and stacking split cordwood by the shed. When he came in, he asked if she'd like to ride along into town for supplies. She hesitated, fingers still wet from rinsing the breakfast dishes. For weeks, she'd kept her distance from Main Street, content to let him handle errands. But a part of her wondered, if she walked beside him openly, would the whispers die down or sharpen into knives? She agreed. The morning air was crisp, the road hard beneath the wagon wheels. Jonas's hands rested loose on the reins, but his posture was watchful, the way a man looks when he knows trouble could be waiting. Elara kept her shawl wrapped tight, the pale blue dress beneath it still pulling at the shoulders, no matter how she'd mended it. They reached Main Street mid-morning. The saloon doors swung open as they passed, spilling the sharp scent of whiskey and the kind of laughter that cut at the edges. Two men leaned on the porch railing, eyes following her in that familiar way. Half appraisal, half insult. One muttered something low, and the other's chuckle carried across the street. Jonas didn't turn his head, but his jaw set. At the mercantile, the owner greeted them with cautious respect. Jonas ordered flour, coffee, and nails, then stepped aside to let her choose a length of cloth. She picked a sturdy brown weave, enough to reinforce the bodice so it wouldn't slip at the shoulders. Jonas paid without blinking. From there, they stopped at the cobbler's. Her boots had rubbed her heels raw for days, and Jonas said flatly, "We're fixing that today." The cobbler measured her feet without a word and returned with the only pair close to her size. Men's boots, thick-soled and built for weather. When she laced them up, she felt the unfamiliar space at the toes, a reminder that something could fit without hurting. Jonas paid and carried the old boots out himself. But trouble hadn't forgotten them. Passing the saloon again, the same men leaned forward. One called out, voice dripping mock humor, "Big woman like that, you'll need a bigger house, Rourke." It was the kind of jeer she'd heard her entire life, but hearing it with Jonas there, out loud, in front of half the street, was different. Her stomach knotted and she quickened her pace. Jonas stopped cold. When he turned, his voice wasn't raised, but it carried like a crack of distant thunder. You'll keep your mouth shut around her? There was no bluster, no need for show, just weight, the kind that made men shift in their boots. The smirk slid from the speaker's face, and neither man said another word. Jonas didn't wait for a reply. He took her hand, openly, in front of everyone, and led her straight down the street. She realized they weren't heading back to the wagon. Instead, he stopped at the small church at the far end of town. Inside, the preacher looked up from his desk, startled but silent. Jonas said simply, "We're getting married. Today." There was no proposal, no speech, just a decision, solid as fence posts set deep in the ground. The preacher's wife acted as witness. Vows were spoken, papers signed, and a plain gold band slid onto her finger. It wasn't polished, but it was hers. When they stepped outside, Jonas kissed her right there on the steps. Not shy, not rushed. His hand rested at her waist, and anyone watching knew there was no shame in it. For the first time, the weight of the stairs felt different. Not because they'd gone away, but because they no longer mattered. That night, in the small mirror above the washstand, the ring caught the lamplight. For years, she'd been told no man would claim her, no home would keep her. Now she had both, and a husband who had taken his stand in front of the whole town. Winter came early to Red Hollow, laying frost across the yard before the last leaves had fallen. The small gold band on Elara's finger had barely warmed to her skin before she began to notice something she couldn't quite explain. Slower mornings, a heaviness in her body, the kind of tired that no night's sleep could fix. At first, she blamed the cold and the work. But as the weeks passed, her mind kept circling back to a thought she didn't dare say aloud. One evening, while Jonas was stacking wood by the shed, she sat on the bed in the small room they now shared and counted the days on the small paper calendar tacked to the wall. Twice. 3 times. The answer didn't change. Her stomach tightened. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of stunned defiance. She'd been told her whole life that her size made her less of a woman, that no man would want her, and that even if one did, her body would never give him children. That cruelty had been repeated so often she'd begun to believe it. Jonas came in from the cold, dusting frost from his coat. He noticed her quiet before she'd spoken a word. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She gripped the quilt in her lap. "I might be expecting." For a moment, the room held still. His hand stilled on the back of the chair. Then, slowly, his shoulders eased, and he stepped closer. "You think so?" "I'm late," she said, keeping her voice steady. His reply was simple, almost matter-of-fact. "If you are, we'll be ready. If you're not, nothing changes." No flinch, no calculation in his eyes, just the steady weight of a man who meant exactly what he said. She hadn't realized until then how much of her had been bracing for a different answer. The next morning, she walked to the edge of town where the midwife, an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, lived in a cabin tucked among bare cottonwoods. After a few quiet questions, the woman gave a single nod. "From what you've told me, I'd say it's likely. Your body's doing exactly what it should." By the time Elara returned, Jonas was on the porch, repairing a harness strap. When she told him what the midwife had said, his face broke into a rare smile, one that reached his eyes. "Then we get ready," he said simply. From that day, the house took on a different rhythm. Jonas built a cradle from pine, smoothing every edge by hand, while Elara sewed tiny clothes from scraps of flannel and cotton she'd bargained for at the mercantile. The work was steady, almost quiet, but beneath it, her old anger still lived, sharper than ever. She remembered every face that had told her she'd never have this, every voice that had cut her down, every glance meant to shrink her. As her belly grew, the whispers in town changed tone. Some came to the house with bread or stew, curiosity softening into acceptance when they saw the gold band on her hand and the steady presence of Jonas at her side. Others still muttered behind their doors, unwilling to let go of their old contempt. She noticed them, but she no longer bent under it. The night her labor began, the cold had crept deep into the house, and the fire in the stove was burning low. The pains came hard and fast, and Jonas moved with the precision of a man used to emergencies, sending for the midwife, stoking the fire, keeping water boiling on the stove. The hours blurred into a rhythm of pain and breath. Elara gripped the bed frame, sweat dampening her hair. Jonas stayed at her side through every wave, his voice low and steady, not filling the air with useless words, just there. When the first cry broke the air, it felt like sunlight through storm clouds. The midwife laid a small, warm, squirming girl in Elara's arms. Jonas stood over them, eyes fixed on the child. When her tiny fist curled around his finger, she saw his jaw tighten, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes glistened. They named her Maeve, after Jonas's mother. In the weeks that followed, Jonas took on the heavy work so Elara could rest. She kept the baby close, learning the sound of every sigh, the way her small fingers clung to the fabric of her mother's dress. Standing on the porch one spring afternoon, Maeve in her arms, Elara watched Jonas mending the fence. The sight filled her with something fiercer than peace, ownership. For the first time, she could look at a home, a man, and a child, and know they were hers. By early summer, the yard at the Rourke place had turned green again. Jonas's bean rows stretched neat, and even beside the fence and the apple saplings he'd planted along the south side were finally taking root. Elara would stand on the porch in the mornings, Maeve cradled against her shoulder, listening to the steady thud of Jonas's hammer as he mended a section of the barn roof. The sound had become part of her, like the scent of coffee in the kitchen or the warmth of the evening lamp. But peace in Red Hollow never came without a shadow. It started with small things. A horse tethered too close to their gate, a boot print in the soft dirt under the kitchen window. At first, Elara chalked it up to wandering stock and the wind-carrying tracks, but by the third morning she knew better. Someone had been watching. Jonas saw it too. One night, after Maeve was asleep, he bolted the front door and set his rifle by the table. "If someone's got business here, they can knock in daylight," he said flatly. 2 days later, the knock came. Loud, deliberate. Elara opened the door to find 3 men on the porch, the kind with dust-stiff coats and the swagger of men used to taking what they wanted. The one in front tipped his hat in a mock gesture. "Heard tell you've got something here that used to belong to other folks." His eyes slid past her, toward the cradle inside. Every muscle in her body tightened. "Nothing here belongs to you," she said, her voice low but steady. Jonas came up behind her, stepping into the doorway like a wall. "You heard her," he said. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Word is, a woman like that—" His chin jerked toward Elara. "And a baby like that fetch a good price west of the mountains." The fury that had lived in Elara for years, fed by every insult, every dismissal, every hand that had tried to shove her aside, rose up so fast she almost shook with it. She stepped forward before Jonas could stop her. "You take one step toward that gate again," she said, "and I'll make sure your own mother wouldn't know you after." The man's smirk faltered, just enough for her to see the flicker of doubt. Jonas's voice cut in, low and hard. "Leave. Now." They left, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. That night, Elara sat at the kitchen table long after Jonas had gone to check the barn. Her mind raced through every possible outcome. She'd spent most of her life running from trouble, moving before anyone could force her hand. But now, with Maeve asleep in the small room off the hall and Jonas mending gear in the shed, she realized she was done running. The next day, she went into town with Maeve in her arms. She stopped at the mercantile, the blacksmith, even the saloon, places she knew the gossip would spread fastest, and made sure people saw her. Saw them. Every word, every look said without saying. She was not hiding, and she was not alone. By the week's end, word had reached even the far end of the valley that the Rourke place was not an easy mark. But shadows still moved where the light didn't reach. Jonas began keeping the rifle within arm's reach no matter the hour. Elara kept the axe by the door, not for wood. One evening, while Jonas was away hauling a load, she caught sight of movement at the edge of the cottonwoods. A man stood there, half hidden, watching the house. She held his gaze from the porch until he turned away, but the message was written clear as smoke. Someone still thought they could take what was hers. That night, when Jonas returned, she told him exactly what she'd seen. His jaw tightened. "Then we make it clear they can't," he said. Over the next week, they reinforced the fence, added a second bolt to the back door, and set lanterns in the yard. Elara helped haul wood, her arms aching, but she didn't stop. Each swing of the hammer, each knot in the rope, felt like laying claim to something no one would steal again. When the first hard rain of summer came, they sat at the table with Maeve between them, her small hands slapping the wood. The storm rattled the shutters, but inside the air was steady. Elara looked around the room, the smooth cradle Jonas had built, the shelves lined with jars she'd filled, the rifle leaning within reach, and felt the weight of her father's last words crumble into dust. Whatever threat came next, they would meet it together. And this time, component placement. She wouldn't just stand her ground, she'd make the ground itself dangerous to anyone who tried to take it. The story of Elara and Jonas isn't just a Wild West romance. It's a reminder of what happens when two people refuse to let the world define their worth. Elara began in the dust, carrying years of cruelty from her own family and strangers alike. She had been told she was too big, too strange, and too unworthy to ever have a home, a husband, or a child. Those words could have broken her for good. But the lesson here is clear. Other people's limitations do not have to become your truth. Jonas's quiet strength teaches another truth, that protection, respect, and love do not come from loud promises, but from consistent actions. He did not try to change Elara into someone smaller or easier to accept. He simply made space for her to exist fully, without apology. In doing so, he showed that real partnership means standing beside someone when the world stares them down. Together, they built something no amount of gossip or malice could take apart. A home forged through shared work, trust, and a willingness to fight for each other. Even when threats came to their doorstep, Elara chose not to run. Instead, she stood her ground, not just for herself, but for the life she and Jonas had created. The deeper lesson is that dignity is not given. It is claimed. Love does not erase the scars of the past, but it can turn them into armor. And sometimes, the most radical thing a person can do is refuse to be diminished.